I woke up on the cold concrete floor, my cheek pressed against the damp surface. And for a moment, I could not tell if I was alive or already halfway gone. The air around me was heavy with mildew and dust, the kind of smell that sinks into your throat and makes every breath burn. A single bulb hung from the ceiling above, flickering with a dull yellow light that threw shadows across the basement walls. My wrists ached. The ropes around them were pulled so tight I could feel the skin already raw and broken. My ankles were bound as well, and every time I shifted my body, the ties cut deeper. I tried to sit up, but the pressure against my chest made me dizzy. The last clear image I could remember was the glass of red wine, the bitter taste that lingered in my mouth just before the world collapsed. I thought for a second I was in a nightmare, but the pain was too real. The pounding in my head was too sharp. From above, faint voices filtered through the floorboards. They were not frantic or worried, they were calm, steady like a conversation after dinner. My father's voice rose above the rest, the same voice that once told me bedtime stories now colder than ice. "She will not last long. We will be better off when this is over." The words sank into me slowly, heavier than the ropes, heavier than the darkness. My own father was speaking of me as if I were a burden to be carried off, not a daughter. I waited for my mother to protest, for Marion to whisper, "No, we cannot do this. She is our child." Instead, silence. Then a door closed upstairs and the creak of footsteps faded away. I lay there staring at the cracks in the basement wall and realized there would be no one coming down to help me. They had put me here on purpose. This was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a decision. I tested the ropes again. They did not give. The more I pulled, the more they burned into my wrists. A low whimper slipped from my throat, half pain, half disbelief. My parents had left me here to die. I thought about the meals around the kitchen table, the forced prayers before bed, the sermons at church where they sat in the front pew pretending to be the picture of devotion. None of it mattered now. When the door shut above me, they had chosen to erase me. The basement was not entirely silent. Water dripped somewhere in the corner, steady and rhythmic, like a clock ticking down the time I had left. Each drop echoed in my skull. My stomach twisted with hunger, my throat dry, but the fear outweighed every physical need. I could feel my pulse hammering inside my ears. I closed my eyes and for a second imagined opening them to see sunlight, to see that this had all been a terrible dream. But when I opened them, the bulb still flickered, the ropes still cut, and the basement walls still closed in around me. I thought about the life insurance policies my father had mentioned months before, half in anger, half in jest. At the time, I brushed it off as another controlling remark. Now those words returned like a blade. My life had become a calculation, my death a payout. The basement air grew colder as the hours dragged. I lost track of time quickly. Minutes felt like hours, hours felt like days. Every time I shifted, the ropes tore into me again. I could hear my breath catching in the stillness, shallow and uneven. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but the sound was hoarse and thin, swallowed by the stone walls. The realization cut through me harder than the ropes. They were not waiting for me to recover. They were waiting for me to die. It would be easier for them. Cleaner. A signature on a claim form, a check in the mail, and their problems solved. My existence had been reduced to paperwork. I pressed my forehead against the floor, the cold seeping into my skin, and thought about what it meant to be disposable to the people who created you. The people who were supposed to guard your first steps and your first words had decided your last breath was more valuable than your future. In that suffocating basement, I felt the weight of every memory with them. The moments of laughter that now tasted false, the rare hugs that now felt staged, the discipline that had always been harsher on me than on my brother. It all aligned into one terrible truth. I was not meant to survive them. I was meant to fund them. I pulled once more against the ropes, my wrists screaming, my voice breaking, and I asked myself the only question that mattered. What would you do if the people who raised you decided your death was worth more than your life? My name is Clara Dawson, and I was 28 years old when the people who were supposed to be my guardians turned into the architects of my destruction. To understand how I ended up on that basement floor, you have to know the family I came from. On the surface, we looked respectable. My father, Victor Dawson, was 55 and a longtime member of the church council. He wore polished shoes, shook hands firmly, and preached about integrity to anyone who would listen. My mother, Marian, was 52 and carried herself like a dutiful wife, always wearing neat dresses and smiling politely at neighbors. My older brother, Ethan, 30, was treated like the golden child introduced at every gathering as the hope of the Dawson family. We attended church twice a week, we smiled for pictures at holidays, we played the role of a proper American family. But that picture was a lie. Behind closed doors, Victor's voice was a whip, and Marian's silence was sharper than any blade. Ethan could do no wrong while every step I took was criticized, diminished, and punished. I learned early that my worth in that house was measured by obedience, by how quietly I could disappear into the background. When I succeeded in school, they called me arrogant. When I failed at something, they called me a disappointment. If Ethan missed payments on his car, they found excuses for him. If I was late to curfew, I was grounded for weeks. The imbalance was constant, relentless, and designed to break me. I remember one evening when Marian stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed as I tried to explain why I had been late from work. She interrupted with a single sentence that seared into me like fire. "You were never meant to shine, Clara. You only take." Those words told me exactly what place I held in her heart. Not daughter, not family, just a burden. I kept trying year after year to earn approval. I studied harder, worked longer shifts, brought home paychecks that I used to cover groceries and bills. None of it changed the way they looked at me. Victor saw me as an asset to be controlled, Marian saw me as a mistake, and Ethan saw me as competition he had already won by birthright. I thought that leaving home would end their hold on me. When I got my first apartment and started working in a small marketing office, I felt a glimpse of freedom. For a while, I believed distance could save me. But the truth was that their reach never really ended. A phone call from my father could still make my chest tighten. A single glare from my mother could still silence me. And Ethan never missed a chance to remind me that no matter what I achieved, I would always be the second child, the lesser sibling. That was the foundation I grew up on. A house that looked perfect from the street, but inside was rotting with cruelty. When you grow up like that, you carry the rot with you. You doubt yourself even when you are right. You feel guilty even when you are innocent. And you convince yourself that family is still family even when every sign points to danger. That was why when they asked me to come back, part of me wanted to believe it was about love. But love was never the Dawson family's language. Control was. By the time I reached my mid-20s, I had built a fragile sense of independence. I rented a small apartment above a bakery, worked steadily at my job, and surrounded myself with people who treated me with kindness. For a short while, I felt that maybe the cycle had been broken. Yet no matter how far I tried to move away from my parents, they always found a way to drag me back. They did not like the idea of me living without their permission. Victor would call late at night, demanding to know where I was, why I had not visited, why I had not given more money toward the house. Marian sent guilt-laced letters reminding me of everything she had sacrificed to raise me. Ethan would casually mention how our parents thought I was selfish. Each intrusion was meant to pull me back under their control. The breaking point came when Ethan's business collapsed. He had invested in a chain of car dealerships with borrowed money and reckless confidence. When it all fell apart, he turned to Victor for rescue, and Victor turned to me. They asked me to co-sign a massive loan to save Ethan from bankruptcy. When I refused, Victor's face twisted with fury. "You think you are better than your own brother," he shouted across the dinner table, his fist slamming against the wood. "Family comes before your selfish pride." Marian sat there with her hands folded, her lips pressed into a thin line, watching me with cold disapproval. Ethan smirked like he knew I would eventually cave. But I did not. For the first time in my life, I said no. The silence that followed was heavier than any blow. Then came the slap. Victor's hand cracked across my face with the force of decades of control. The sting burned hot, but the betrayal burned hotter. I looked to Marian, hoping for a flicker of compassion, but she did nothing. She let it happen. That was when I finally understood that I was not just unloved in that house. I was unwanted. Yet even then, guilt curled around me. I walked home that night with my cheek throbbing and my chest tight, wondering if I had been wrong to refuse. Maybe I should have helped Ethan. Maybe I should have kept the peace. But deep down, I knew the truth. No matter what I gave them, it would never be enough. To them, I was not a daughter. I was a resource, a backup plan, a body they could use when things went wrong. Every memory confirmed it. When Ethan crashed the family car as a teenager, they said boys will be boys and blamed me for distracting him. When I won a scholarship to college, they told me not to brag because Ethan had not gotten one. When I spent hours caring for my sick grandfather, they claimed I was only doing it for attention. Every gesture of mine was twisted into something selfish. Every mistake of Ethan's was forgiven. That imbalance was not an accident. It was a system. The more Ethan failed, the more I was expected to sacrifice. The more I succeeded, the more they tried to cut me down. I began to see the pattern clearly. It was not about love. It was about control and power. And saying no to the loan was my first act of rebellion. It also became the reason they would decide to remove me entirely. At the time, I thought the worst thing that could happen was losing my family. I had no idea that they were already planning to turn me into currency. I did not know then that my refusal to sign Ethan's loan was not just an argument lost at the dinner table. It was the moment my parents began to see me not as a liability to be managed, but as a payout waiting to be claimed. Victor had been obsessed with finances for years. He read every insurance brochure that came in the mail and attended community seminars about estate planning like they were church services. I once laughed when I found a folder labeled Future Contingencies in his study. But what I did not realize was that I was one of those contingencies. Months before the basement, Victor had quietly purchased a life insurance policy in my name worth $1.2 million. He listed himself and Marion as the beneficiaries. To them, my existence had transformed into numbers on a page, a potential solution to Ethan's endless failures and Victor's growing debts. Marion whispered to Ethan late one night, thinking no one could hear. "Once Clara is gone, you will finally have a second chance." Those words were not said in grief. They were said with relief. I was in the hallway when I caught that fragment of conversation. I froze my chest tightening, and for days afterward, I tried to convince myself I had misheard. Insurance second chance, it could have meant anything. But in my stomach, I felt the truth. I was worth more to them dead than alive. The shift in their behavior soon confirmed it. Marion started calling me with a softness that was foreign to her voice, inviting me home for dinners, asking if I had been eating well. Victor dropped by my apartment once carrying a pie as if he were the doting father I had never known. Even Ethan tried sending me casual messages about how we should reconnect. It was all too coordinated, too strange, and yet a small part of me wanted to believe in it. For years I had begged for their approval, and here it was being offered. Maybe I thought this was a chance to fix what had always been broken. When they invited me back for a family dinner, Marion's words were coated in honey. "It is time to be a family again, Clara." She smiled as if decades of cruelty had been erased. I hesitated but agreed because that fragile hope still flickered inside me. I wanted to believe reconciliation was possible. I wanted to believe my family wanted me for me, not for the signature they had failed to get. What I did not know was that the dinner was not an invitation. It was a setup. It was the opening move in a plan that had already been written in contracts and signed with forged handwriting. They were no longer trying to control me. They were preparing to eliminate me. The evening I returned to the Dawson house felt unreal from the moment I stepped through the front door. The air smelled of roasted meat and herbs, the kind of meal Marion only bothered to prepare on holidays, yet this was just an ordinary Friday. The table was set with the old china plates that usually sat locked in the cabinet, the ones reserved for guests who mattered. Marion greeted me with a smile that looked painted on her arms, spreading wide as though she had been waiting for me all her life. "Clara, I made all your favorites. Roast chicken with garlic mashed potatoes, sweet corn." She even placed a slice of chocolate cake in front of my seat before dinner began, something I had not tasted in years. I should have trusted my instincts when my stomach twisted at the sight of such hospitality, but I forced myself to sit. Ethan arrived late, dropping into his chair with a grin that did not touch his eyes. Victor poured wine into crystal glasses and raised his toward me. "To family," he said, and they all repeated the toast. I lifted the glass to my lips, telling myself it would be rude to refuse. The first sip was warm, rich, but then a bitter note clung to the back of my tongue, metallic and wrong. Within minutes, the room spun. I tried to focus on Marian's face, but her smile blurred into shadows. My chest tightened, my arms felt heavy, and I could hear Ethan laughing faintly as if from a distance. The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. The last image before darkness swallowed me was Victor leaning forward, his expression unreadable. When I woke again, I was no longer at the dinner table. My body lay twisted on the cold basement floor, wrists bound behind my back with coarse rope ankles tied so tight I could not move without pain shooting up my legs. The single bulb overhead buzzed faintly, illuminating concrete walls stained with age. Panic surged, but my voice cracked when I tried to scream. The air was thick with mildew and the faint scent of old paint. I shifted and the ropes cut deeper. From above, I heard Marian's voice, calm, almost tender. "Just rest, honey. Everything will be better tomorrow." Her words carried down the wooden stairs, echoing off the stone, and for a moment I wanted to believe her. But the locked door and the silence that followed told me the truth. I had not been brought home to reconcile. I had been brought home to disappear. The first hours in the basement bled together into a haze of fear and confusion. The ropes cut into my wrists until the skin grew raw, every movement sending a jolt of pain up my arms. My head throbbed from whatever had been slipped into my drink, a dull ache that pulsed behind my eyes. The air was damp, carrying the smell of mold and rust, and every breath felt heavier than the last. I tried to listen for footsteps, for a voice, for anything that might mean someone was coming to help, but all I heard was silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards above. Time stretched cruelly. I had no way to mark the minutes, only the slow drip of water from a pipe overhead. Each drop struck the floor with the regularity of a clock, reminding me that while the world moved forward, I was trapped in this concrete tomb. Hours passed before desperation overcame pride. My throat burned from thirst, my stomach cramped with hunger, and my body ached from lying on the hard ground. I pulled against the ropes until my wrists bled, then sagged back against the wall, gasping. Somewhere in the corner, the pipe leaked just enough for droplets to gather before falling. I dragged myself closer, straining against the binds until my tongue caught the cold water. It was filthy metallic with the taste of rust, but it kept me alive. Later, when I turned my head, I spotted an old plastic bottle abandoned near the wall, half crumpled and covered in dust. I twisted my body until I could nudge it closer with my foot. Tilting it awkwardly, I tasted a few mouthfuls of stale water pooled at the bottom. It was enough to dull the fire in my throat and buy me more hours. As the night fell, the bulb flickered, and I noticed something glinting in the corner. Squinting through the dim light, I saw it. A camera mounted high near the ceiling, its lens fixed on me. For a moment, hope sparked that perhaps it was connected to the outside world, that maybe someone somewhere would see me. But then I realized the truth. It was old, wired to a memory card, not to any live network. My parents had installed it not for rescue, but for evidence. They wanted to capture my decline, my desperation, so they could spin a story about how unstable I had been, how I must have harmed myself. I stared at that lifeless camera and felt rage bubble inside me. They were not only killing me, they were writing the script of my death. The hours became a blur of pain and hallucinations. My stomach gnawed at itself, my muscles cramped, and my skin itched with sweat and grime. In the dim light, I spotted papers scattered across the floor near the stairs. I crawled toward them, my knees scraping against the concrete. My fingers brushed the edges of a document, and when I lifted it, I felt the weight of betrayal heavier than any rope. It was a copy of the life insurance policy my name forged on the signature line. They had not even tried to hide it. They had left their crime in plain sight because they believed I would never leave this room. My chest tightened with sobs I could not control. I pressed my forehead against the paper and let the tears soak into it. The girl I had been, the daughter who still hoped for love, died in that moment. What remained was a hollowed version of myself stripped of illusions. I cried until no sound came, until only the rasp of my breath echoed in the basement. The second day was worse. Hunger clawed at me until I felt like my insides were folding in on themselves. Every joint ached, every breath scraped my throat. I drifted in and out of consciousness, waking sometimes to the sound of laughter above muffled but cruel. They were living their lives as if nothing had happened, preparing for the paperwork that would make them rich. Once, through the fog of exhaustion, I heard Ethan's voice clearly. "Tomorrow we submit the claim. It will be quick." The words carried down to me like a death sentence. My body sagged against the wall, my mind torn between fury and despair. I wondered if death would be easier than fighting. Maybe I should just let go, let the darkness swallow me, stop struggling against ropes that refused to break. But every time the thought came, another rose with it. The image of my grandfather Harold, his steady hands guiding mine as he taught me to tie knots in a length of rope, his voice calm and unwavering. "Strength is not in fists, Clara. It is in patience and thinking." Those words returned like a lifeline, yet in those hours before I found any resolve, I broke. I sobbed into the dark until my chest heaved, until I could no longer hear anything but the sound of my own grief. I whispered apologies to myself for trusting them, apologies for still hoping they might love me, apologies for existing. That was my lowest point, alone, half dead on the basement floor. My future stolen, my body weak, my spirit crushed. The silence pressed in, and I accepted that this could be the place I ended. Somewhere between the waves of despair and the pull of unconsciousness, my mind reached back to the only man who had ever treated me with consistent kindness. My grandfather Harold had been a quiet figure in my childhood, a carpenter who smelled of cedar and tobacco, a man who believed in steady work and steady words. I could still picture him on his porch, a coil of rope in his hands, teaching me knots, not because he thought I would need them, but because he believed every lesson mattered. He had looked at me with eyes that saw me as more than a shadow of Ethan, more than a disappointment to Marion, more than a pawn to Victor. He saw me as Clara capable of strength. "Strength is not in fists, Clara," he had told me, his voice calm as he guided my small fingers through the figure-8 loop. "Strength is in patience and thinking. Anyone can thrash against the rope, but only those who think can get free." At the time, I laughed, treating it like a game, but here in the basement, those words returned like a pulse of light. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to listen not to my panic, but to my memory. I shifted my body, ignoring the scream in my shoulders, until I felt the rough edge of something metallic pressed against the wall. It was a shard of rusted metal, maybe once part of a tool long abandoned. I twisted my wrists against it, inch by inch, the rope biting deeper as the blood warmed my skin. Pain flared, but I remembered Harold's words. Patience, thinking. Do not fight the rope work with it. I pressed harder, sawing the fibers one by one, and every strand that snapped felt like a breath of hope. I whispered his name under my breath, not as prayer, but as anchor. "Harold, I can do this." My arms trembled, my head spun, but I did not stop. Minutes bled into hours. My wrists slicked with blood and sweat, my teeth clenched to hold back cries, and finally I felt the rope loosen just enough for me to slip my right hand free. Relief surged through me so powerfully I almost collapsed, but I held on, pulling my left hand until both arms were mine again. I sat there, panting, wrists torn raw, staring at the frayed rope dangling from my skin. For the first time in days, I was no longer only a victim. I was alive, I was thinking, and I had the chance Harold had promised me. The basement was still my prison, but my mind was no longer theirs to control. The moment my wrists came free, a fire lit inside me, faint but undeniable. I was still weak, my body battered, but my mind began to move with clarity. I worked the knots around my ankles, next bending down and biting at the rope with cracked teeth until the fibers loosened enough for me to slide one foot free and then the other. Standing was almost impossible at first. My legs shook violently, threatening to give out, but I forced myself upright and leaned against the wall until the dizziness passed. I could not waste time. They believed I was helpless, and that assumption was my only advantage. I scanned the basement, my eyes settling on the vent grate high on the far wall. It was small, dusty, and screwed loosely into place. I dragged a broken wooden crate beneath it, climbed shakily, and pressed my fingers to the edges until the metal groaned. With one final shove, the grate popped free and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed like thunder, but no footsteps followed. Either they were too far away or too confident to bother checking. I pulled myself inside, scraping my skin against rusted metal, and crawled through the narrow vent, each breath shallow in the stale air. The vent opened behind the kitchen, and through the slits I heard their voices. Ethan's laugh, Marian's calm murmur, Victor's steady baritone. They were drinking coffee as if this was any normal evening. My heart pounded when I caught their words. Tomorrow we submit the claim. They will believe she overdosed. The insurance will cover everything. I froze, pressing my hand against my mouth to silence my breath. They were not even trying to hide it from each other. They had written me off completely already, speaking about my death as if it had happened. Fury steadied my limbs. I edged out of the vent into the hallway, staying low, every creak of the floor a threat. I moved toward Marian's study, remembering how she always locked her phone in the bottom drawer. My hands shook as I rifled through the desk, finally finding the device tucked under notebooks. It was old, the kind she used only when she wanted to keep things private. I unlocked it easily, the code the same as it had always been Ethan's birthday. My chest tightened as I scrolled, finding messages between them about the policy about keeping me quiet. I pressed record on the camera app, creeping back to the kitchen doorway. Through the narrow crack, I captured their voices clearly. Victor's words made bile rise in my throat. She was never strong enough. No one will question this. Tomorrow it will all be finished. I stepped back quickly, almost dropping the phone, but the evidence was mine now. I searched the hall closet next, pulling open drawers, until I found a folder labeled Financial. Inside were copies of the insurance documents my signature forged in neat, practiced strokes. They had not even bothered to disguise it. It was all there, proof enough to bury them. I shoved the papers under my shirt and crept toward the front door, but leaving would not be that simple. Ethan's heavy steps echoed down the hall, and I ducked into the bathroom, holding my breath as he passed. When the sound faded, I slipped out the side door into the cool night. The air hit me like a baptism, sharp and clean against my filthy skin. My legs carried me down the dark street toward the only sanctuary I could think of, the hospital 2 miles away. Each step was agony, but adrenaline pushed me forward. By the time I stumbled through the emergency room doors, my vision blurred and my body swayed. Nurses rushed to my side, gasping at the sight of my wrists and bruised face. I tried to explain, but the words came out broken, slurred by exhaustion. Still, they understood enough. Within minutes, the police were called. A doctor pressed water to my lips, the first clean swallow I had felt in days. I clutched Marian's phone in my bloodied hands, whispering, "It's all in here. The evidence. They wanted me dead." The staff exchanged horrified glances, and one officer leaned down to assure me, "You are safe now." But safety was not what I wanted. I wanted truth, and I wanted justice. The weeks that followed blurred into a whirlwind of hospital rooms, police interviews, and courtroom preparations. My body healed slowly, but my mind stayed sharp with one singular focus. I would not let them silence me again. When the trial began, the courthouse was packed with locals, reporters, and curious onlookers. The headline had already spread across town: "The Basement Insurance Betrayal." I walked into that courtroom, still thin, still bruised, but standing tall. Every step echoed on the polished floor, a reminder that I had survived the fate they designed for me. Across the room sat Victor and Marian, both dressed as though appearance could erase guilt. Victor in a pressed suit, his expression stoic. Marian in a modest dress, her face carefully painted with sorrow. Ethan sat between them restless, his jaw clenched tight. They looked like a family grieving a tragedy, not the architects of one. Their lawyer spoke first, painting me as unstable, fragile, a woman prone to dramatics. He claimed I had harmed myself, that my accusations were fantasies spun from resentment. But my lawyer Miranda stood firm. She began with the simplest words. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not imagination. This is evidence." She displayed the photographs of my bruised wrists and ankles, each image larger than life on the projector screen. The jury shifted uncomfortably. She played the recordings from Marion's phone, Victor's voice unmistakable. "Tomorrow we submit the claim. They will believe she overdosed." The room fell into a heavy silence. Then she held up the forged insurance forms, pointing to the handwriting analysis that proved my signature had been faked. Finally, she presented the memory card from the old camera, which had recorded hours of me tied begging fighting to survive. Every lie my parents had prepared unraveled piece by piece. When the evidence ended, the air was so tense I could hear the hum of the lights above. Victor's lawyer tried to object, tried to dismiss the documents as circumstantial, but the damage was done. The jurors had seen too much. I sat there listening. My stomach knotted until it was my turn to speak. When I took the stand, my voice trembled at first, but then it steadied. I told them everything. I told them about the dinner, the bitter taste in the wine, the days in the basement where I begged the walls for mercy. I described the pipe water that kept me alive, the papers scattered near the stairs, the words I overheard that condemned me. And then I looked at Victor and Marion, meeting their eyes for the first time since I escaped. "You were supposed to protect me. Instead, you calculated my death like a bank account." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but I did not stop. "You wanted me gone. But I am still here." The judge listened carefully, his face unreadable, until the closing arguments ended and the jury left to deliberate. Hours felt like days as we waited, tension hanging like fog. Finally, they returned, the foreman rose holding the paper that would decide everything. "We find the defendants Victor Dawson and Marion Dawson guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted homicide, and insurance fraud. We find Ethan Dawson guilty of aiding and abetting." Gasps erupted in the room. Marion's painted mask cracked, her eyes wide with disbelief. Victor clenched his fists but stayed silent. Ethan cursed under his breath, his bravado gone. The judge delivered the sentence with deliberate gravity. 30 years in state prison for Victor and Marion, no parole for the first 15, 10 years for Ethan. His voice carried finality, and in that moment I felt the weight of their power slip away. Reporters swarmed as we left the courthouse, cameras, flashing microphones thrust toward me. "Do you have a statement, Clara? Do you have anything to say to your parents?" My answer was simple. Justice is not revenge. Justice is survival with dignity. The quote ran in headlines across the state. Neighbors who once looked past my bruises now stared with apology in their eyes. Strangers wrote letters calling me brave. But none of it erased the years of cruelty. None of it replaced what had been stolen. What it did give me was freedom. For the first time in my life, my story was louder than their lies. After the trial ended and the sentences were handed down, the town slowly shifted its gaze away from the Dawsons and back toward its own routines. But for me, life would never return to what it once had been. The basement walls, the ropes, the camera lens watching me suffer, all of it stayed etched into my memory. Yet I refused to let those memories be the only definition of who I was. I moved 2 hours away to a small town where no one recognized my face from the news. And there, I found a little building on Main Street with peeling paint and an empty front window. I bought it with the compensation the court forced my parents to pay, and I turned it into something new, something alive. I named the Café Phoenix because I wanted to remind myself every day that I had been burned down to ash but had risen again. The place smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread, the kind of scents that carried comfort instead of fear. People came not just for the drinks, but for the quiet atmosphere, a place where they could breathe. Some knew who I was, some did not, and that was fine. What mattered was that I was no longer the girl tied in a basement. I was the woman standing behind the counter, creating something of her own. Journalists came occasionally asking for interviews, and once I agreed. The reporter asked if I considered what had happened to me an act of revenge now that my parents were in prison. I shook my head slowly, looking out the window at the autumn leaves drifting by. Justice is not revenge, I said. Justice is survival with dignity. That line traveled farther than I expected, quoted in newspapers and online. But to me, it was not about attention. It was about truth. I still woke some nights in a cold sweat, hearing Victor's voice in my dreams, feeling Marion's words sting like blades, but the mornings were different now. I would step onto the cafe porch, breathe the crisp air, and remind myself that every sunrise was mine. Sometimes customers asked about the name Phoenix, and I would smile and tell them it was about starting again. I rarely told the whole story, but I did not need to. The cafe spoke for me. Each cup poured, each loaf baked was a quiet declaration that I had survived. On the 1-year anniversary of the trial, a local radio host invited me to share a message with listeners. I spoke directly, my voice steady. What would you do if the people who raised you decided your life was worth less than a check I asked? The line hung in the air before I added, I hope you would fight. I hope you would refuse to let them write your ending. Because the truth is, we always have a choice to stand back up. My words reached people I would never meet, and letters poured in from across the country, some from women who had endured abuse, some from men who had been betrayed by family, some from strangers who simply wanted to say they believed in me. I kept them in a box under the counter, a reminder that my pain had not been wasted. It had become connection. Life is not perfect now. The scars on my wrists remain, and the shadows of memory creep back when I least expect them. But when I unlock the cafe each morning and see the sign with the word Phoenix painted in bold red letters, I know that survival is not just about breathing. It is about choosing to live fully despite the darkness. And in that choice lies a quiet kind of justice.